the primordial beginning, asterisk, close your eyes and imagine, ... nothing, not darkness, not silence, not even emptiness as we understand it. Try to picture a state before existence itself, before time had meaning, before space stretched in any direction. It's almost impossible, isn't it? Our human minds struggle with the concept of true nothingness because we've never experienced it. We've always existed in a world of something light and shadow, sound and silence, presence and absence. But the ancient Greeks, those brilliant storytellers who lived thousands of years ago, they tried to imagine it. They called it chaos. Chaos wasn't a god, not really. It wasn't a being with thoughts or desires. It was simply the void, the gap, the yawning emptiness that existed before anything else. When you hear the word chaos today, you might think of disorder, of things spinning out of control. But to the Greeks, chaos was something different. Tit was potential, pregnant with possibility, the canvas before the first brushstroke of creation. And from this chaos, slowly, mysteriously, the first beings emerged, not created by anyone, not born in any way we'd understand, but simply coming into existence because existence itself was beginning to unfold. Imagine you're there, in that moment, between nothing and something, witnessing the very first stirrings of reality. The first to emerge was Gaia. Feel her presence solid, eternal, vast beyond comprehension. Gaia was the earth itself, not as we know it, with mountains and valleys and oceans, but as the fundamental ground of being. She was matter taking form, stability emerging from chaos. If you could have stood in that primordial moment, you might have felt her beneath you, ancient and patient, the mother of everything that would follow. The Greeks didn't see Earth as just dirt and rock. They saw it as alive, conscious, divine. Gaia was the beginning of all physical existence, the foundation upon which every story would unfold. But Gaia wasn't alone in those first moments. From chaos also came Tartarus, and here the Greeks revealed something profound about their understanding of existence. Tartarus was the deepest abyss, the darkest depth, a place so far below the earth that an anvil dropped from the surface would fall for 9 days before reaching it. Why did the Greeks need this place to exist from the very beginning? Perhaps because they understood that creation requires depth, that for something to rise, there must be somewhere to fall. Light needs darkness to define it. Tartarus was the cosmic basement, the place of punishment and imprisonment that would play such a crucial role in the stories to come. Then came Eros, and this might surprise you. Not the chubby cherub with arrows that we often picture today, but something far more primal and essential. This Eros was the force of attraction itself, the pull that would draw things together, the desire that would make creation continue. Without Eros, everything that emerged from chaos might have simply drifted apart, separate and alone. But with Eros present, from the very beginning, there was a force urging connection, union, the mingling that would create new things. The Greeks understood something we sometimes forget, that love, or at least desire, is as fundamental to existence as matter itself. Erebus emerged to the personification of deep darkness and shadow, and his sister Nyx, the night itself. Can you picture her? Nyx was so powerful, so primordial, that even Zeus, the mighty king of gods, who would come much later, feared her. She was darkness, not as the absence of light, but as a thing unto itself, thick, rich, enveloping. And from Nyx, through some mysterious process that the myths describe in different ways, came ether, the bright upper air, and Himra, the day. Light from darkness, day from night. The Greeks were telling us something about the nature of existence, that opposites don't just coexist. They give birth to each other. As you lie here, breathing slowly, let yourself feel the weight of these first moments of creation. The Greeks weren't scientists in our modern sense, but they were observers of patterns, philosophers trying to make sense of why anything exists at all. They looked at the world around them and asked the questions humans have always asked. Where did all this come from? Why is there something rather than nothing? How did order emerge from disorder? Their answer was story, not dry philosophy or abstract theory, but vivid, emotional narrative, populated by beings they could imagine and relate to. Gaia wasn't just the earth. She was a mother, capable of love and pain and anger. Chaos wasn't just randomness. It was the mysterious source from which consciousness itself emerged. These primordial beings were the Greeks' way of saying that existence is fundamentally strange, fundamentally wonderful, and fundamentally beyond our complete understanding. Think about what it means that the Greeks placed Eros, attraction, lavat, the very foundation of reality. They were saying that the universe isn't cold and mechanical, that connection and longing are woven into the fabric of existence itself. Everything that would come after, in Greek mythology, all the love affairs and jealousies, all the passionate conflicts and tender reunions, wasn't separate from the nature of the cosmos. It was expressing the cosmos's deepest nature. And consider how they imagined these first beings simply emerging from chaos, not created by a conscious deity with a plan. There's something both humbling and empowering in that vision. Consciousness arose from unconsciousness. Order emerged from formlessness. Meaning came from meaninglessness. The Greeks were comfortable with mystery in a way that's almost foreign to our modern minds, which want every question answered, every process explained as your breathing deepens and slows. Picture Gaia in those first moments of her existence. She's there, solid and real, the foundation of everything. But she's also alone, aware of herself in a way the unconscious chaos never was. What does it feel like to be the first conscious being, with no parent, no creator, no companion? The Greeks, with their gift for emotional insight, understood that even the earth itself might feel loneliness. And so the story continues, as stories must. From these primordial beings, more would come. Gaia would not remain alone. The emptiness would fill with gods and monsters, heroes and mortals, love and war, creation and destruction. But it all began here, in this moment of mysterious emergence, when the first beings opened their eyes. If eyes they had and became aware that they existed. This is where Greek mythology truly begins. Not with Zeus throwing thunderbolts from Mount Olympus, not with heroes slaying monsters, but with these strange, abstract, powerful beings arising from nothing, establishing the foundations of reality. The Greeks put thought and care into these origins because they understood that how a story begins shapes everything that follows. If reality itself emerged from chaos through mysterious, natural processes, if desire and darkness and earth were there from the start, then everything else, Saul the complex, messy. Passionate stories of gods and mortals makes a certain kind of sense, so rest here for a moment. In the primordial beginning, when everything was new and potential was infinite, let the weight of these first moments settle over you like a blanket. The ancient Greeks looked at their world with wonder, asking the deepest questions, and they answered with stories that still echo in our minds thousands of years later. That's the power of mythology, speaks to something timeless in the human heart, something that recognizes truth even when it's wrapped in impossibility. Now, from this foundation, our story grows more complex, more dramatic, more human, because Gaia, conscious and alone, was about to do something that would set in motion conflicts that would shape the cosmos forever. Asterisk. The Titans rise, children of earth and sky. Asterisk. But from this endless void, something stirred. Gaia, the earth herself, was not content to exist alone in the vast emptiness. From her own substance, without partner or father, she brought forth Iranista sky. Imagine standing on a primordial hillside and watching as the heavens themselves took form above you, spreading in every direction, a vast dome of consciousness stretching over the world. Uranus was magnificent, equal to Gaia in size and scope, covering her completely. He was the starry sky, the vault of heaven, and he looked down upon his mother with something that might have been wonder, or might have been desire, or perhaps both. Gaia and Uranus came together, earth and sky, in a union that was both beautiful and strange. From this coupling, children were born, but not children as you and I would understand them. These were the Titans, beings of immense power and scale, each one representing fundamental forces of the cosmos. There were 12 of them, 6 sons and 6 daughters, and their names still echo through our language and culture today. Oceanus was the eldest. The great river that the Greeks believed encircled the entire world, the source of all fresh water. Imagine a being so vast that his body formed the boundary of existence itself. His sister and wife was Theseus, and together they would give birth to the rivers and streams, the nymphs that inhabited every waterway known to the ancient world. Then came Hyperion, who would father the sun, moon, and dawnlight itself would descend from him. They was his consort, a Titaness whose name meant divine or goddess, and whose children would illuminate the world. Zeus and Phoebe represented the axis of heaven, the cosmic pillars, though their exact roles in the mythology shift and blur across different tellings. What matters is their presence, their place in the foundation of reality. Crius was another of these early Titans. Associated with the constellations and the measurement of time, the Greeks saw the stars as a great clock, marking the seasons and the passage of years. Iapetus would become the father of Prometheus, Atlas, and Epimetheus names you'll recognize as we continue our journey. The Titanesses were equally powerful. Mnemosyne was memory itself, the force that allows the past to persist into the present. Without her, there would be no history, no learning, no story to tell. Themis embodied divine law and order, the principles that would govern even the gods themselves. She represented the idea that the universe operates according to certain rules, certain patterns that even the mighty must respect. Rhea, gentle Rhea, would become crucial to our story. Remember her name, for she carried both great sorrow and great courage in her heart. And then there was Kronos, the youngest of the Titans. The Greeks called him Kronos, sometimes Chronos, and his name would become synonymous with time itself. Though originally they were separate concepts, Kronos was clever, ambitious, and willing to do what his siblings would not. He would change everything. But before we speak of Kronos's great deed, we must understand what made it necessary. You see, Gaia and Uranus continued to create together, but not all their children were as magnificent as the Titans. They also gave birth to the Cyclopes, three massive beings, each with a single eye in the center of his forehead. Brontes, Sterops, and Arges, their names meant thunder, lightning, and brightness. They were craftsmen of incredible skill, though the world didn't know it yet. And there were three more sons, the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones. Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges each had 50 heads and 100 arms, beings of such overwhelming power that their very existence was terrifying. Uranus looked upon these strange, powerful children and felt something dark rise in his heart. Fear, perhaps. Disgust, certainly. He saw them not as offspring to be cherished, but as threats to be contained. And so he did something unforgivable. He took these children, his own sons, and thrust them back into Gaia's body, forcing them deep into the earth, imprisoning them in the darkness of her womb. Imagine the pain of that, not just the physical agony of having these enormous beings trapped inside you, but the emotional anguish of a mother watching her husband brutalize her children. Gaia suffered. She groaned with the weight and pain of her imprisoned sons. She tried to reason with Uranus, but he was the sky, distant and unreachable, looking down from above with cold indifference. He came to her still, spreading over her each night, but there was no tenderness anymore, only domination. The first marriage had become a prison for them both, he trapped by his fear, she trapped by her pain. Finally, Gaia's suffering became unbearable. She reached deep within herself, into her own substance, and drew forth the hardest thing she could create. From this stone, she fashioned a sickle, a curved blade with teeth like a saw. Then she called her children, the Titans, to her and showed them what she had made. Her voice, which had once sung the world into being, now trembled with pain and rage. "My children," she said, "your father has committed a great wrong. He has imprisoned your brothers in my depths, and I can bear this agony no longer. Which of you will help me? Which of you has the courage to stand against Uranus and free your siblings?" The Titans looked at each other in fear and uncertainty. Uranus was vast, powerful, their father. To move against him was unthinkable. The silence stretched long, broken only by Gaia's labored breathing, the sound of the earth itself in distress. But then Kronos, the youngest, stepped forward. Perhaps he was braver than his siblings. Perhaps he was more ambitious. Perhaps he simply loved his mother more than he feared his father. Whatever his motivation, he took the sickle from Gaia's hands and felt its weight. "I will do it, mother," he said. "Tell me what must be done," Gaia instructed him carefully. That night, when Uranus came to spread himself over the earth, when he came to lie with Gaia, as he did each evening, Kronos would be waiting. Hidden, crouched in ambush, he would strike at the moment of his father's greatest vulnerability. And Kronos, dutiful and terrible, did exactly as his mother asked. When Uranus came that night, vast and unsuspecting, Kronos reached out with the stone sickle and, in one swift, brutal motion, castrated his father. The sky screamed, a sound that echoed across the entire cosmos, the first cry of divine pain. Blood fell from the wound, not blood as we know it, but ichor, the divine fluid of the gods. Where it struck the earth, it gave birth to new beings. The drops that landed on Gaia's surface became the Furies, ancient goddesses of vengeance, and the giants, and the Malaya, the nymphs of ash trees. The severed pieces fell into the sea, and the waves churned white with foam around them. And from that foam, that mixture of sea and divine essence, something beautiful and terrible emerged. A woman formed from the waves, fully grown, radiantly lovely, stepping onto the shore of Cyprus or Cythera, depending on which telling you believe. This was Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, born not from nurturing and care, but from violence and separation. Is it any wonder that Greek love stories so often involved passion that bordered on madness, desire that destroyed as much as it created? Aphrodite carried her origins in her nature love, born from castration, beauty born from blood. Uranus, wounded and diminished, pulled away from Gaia. He retreated to the upper regions of the cosmos, no longer the enveloping presence he once was. The sky and earth were now separate, held apart by the violence that had freed the Titans from their father's oppression. Uranus, in his pain and rage, spoke a prophecy that would echo through the ages. You, Kronos, will suffer as I have suffered. Your own children will overthrow you, just as you have overthrown me. The pattern is set. What you have done to me will be done to you. Have you ever wondered why ancient people saw the sky as separate from the earth? Drop a comment with your thoughts. Because the Greeks had their answer, a story of family violence, of a mother's desperation and a son's courage or ambition. They looked at the vast space between ground and sky and saw not just distance but separation, the result of a cosmic divorce forced by intolerable cruelty. Kronos freed his imprisoned brothers from Gaia's depths. The Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires emerged, blinking, into a world they had never seen. But Kronos, despite his role as liberator, was not entirely comfortable with these strange, powerful siblings. He had acted out of love for his mother, perhaps, or out of ambition, certainly. But he had also inherited something from his father, that fear of being overthrown, that need for control. The Titans now ruled the cosmos. Kronos took his father's place as the supreme power, and the age of the Titans began. But already, in those first moments of his reign, the seeds of his downfall had been planted. His father's curse hung over him like a storm cloud, and deep in his heart, Kronos knew that the pattern his mother had set, child, overthrowing parent, might not end with him. As you settled deeper into rest, feel the weight of these ancient patterns. The Greeks understood something profound about families, about power, about the cycles that repeat through generations. They knew that violence begets violence, that fear creates the very things we fear. And they told these truths through stories of gods so large they filled the sky, so powerful they shaped the world, yet so human in their flaws that we recognize ourselves in them even now. Thousands of years later, the age of Titans, Kronos' golden rule and fear, but Kronos, now king of the cosmos, carried a weight heavier than his crown. The Titans organized themselves across the world, each taking domains and responsibilities, establishing an order that would last for untold ages. Kronos ruled from the heights, his sister Rhea beside him as his queen and consort. Together they presided over what many called the golden age, a time of abundance and peace, when the earth gave forth her fruits without labor, when humans lived simply and contentedly, when death came gently like sleep, and yet, beneath this golden surface, darkness gathered. Kronos could not forget his father's words. That prophecy haunted him, whispered to him in quiet moments, invaded his dreams, if dreams the Titans had. Your own children will overthrow you, just as you have overthrown me. The pattern is set. Kronos had proven the prophecy's first half true. Why should the second half not also come to pass? Rhea, gentle Rhea, knew nothing of her husband's growing paranoia at first. She felt only joy when she discovered she was with child, carrying new life within her. She imagined a son or daughter who would inherit this golden world, who would know only peace and plenty. She made preparations with a mother's tender anticipation, thinking of names, dreaming of the future. But Kronos watched her growing belly with something very different from joy. He watched it with dread. When Rhea's time came and she delivered her first child, a daughter, beautiful and perfect, whom they named Hestia, Kronos asked to hold the infant. Rhea, exhausted but radiant with new motherhood, placed the baby in her husband's arms. She expected to see his face soften with paternal love. Instead, she watched in frozen horror as Kronos opened his mouth and swallowed their daughter whole. Not chewing, not killing, but swallowing, trapping the infant goddess inside himself, where she could never grow to threaten him. Rhea's scream echoed across the heavens. She lunged for him, desperate to somehow retrieve her child, but it was too late. Hestia was gone, imprisoned in the darkness of her father's belly. Kronos looked at his wife with eyes both guilty and defiant. It must be done, he told her. The prophecy must not come to pass. I will not fall as my father fell. She was our daughter. Rhea cried, and you can hear in that cry the voice of every mother who has watched her child suffer. Our baby. How could you? But Kronos was unmoved, or rather, he moved beyond his guilt. There will be others, he said, though whether this was meant as comfort or threat, even he might not have known. And there were others. Rhea conceived again, because what choice did she have? She was queen of the Titans, wife to the ruler of the cosmos, and the patterns of their world demanded children. She gave birth to Demeter, and this time she knew what was coming. She held her daughter for only moments, memorizing every detail of her tiny face, before Kronos took her and swallowed her too. Then came Hera, regal even as an infant, and she too disappeared down her father's throat. The pattern repeated with mechanical horror. Can you imagine Rhea's grief? Each pregnancy filled her with hope, despite herself. Perhaps this time would be different. Perhaps he would relent. Perhaps love would prove stronger than fear. And each time she watched her husband consume their child, trapping another divine life in the prison of his body. The children weren't dead. She knew that somehow. They were immortal, as all gods were. But they weren't alive either. Not really. They existed in a state of suspension, conscious but trapped, growing but confined, aware but unable to act. When Rhea conceived her fourth child, a son this time, she began to plan. She carried Hades in her womb and whispered to him in the quiet moments, telling him about the world he would never see, about the brothers and sisters waiting for him in their father's belly. When he was born and Kronos swallowed him, Rhea felt something harden in her heart. Love for her children, yes, but something else. A cold determination. An echo, perhaps, of the strength her mother Gaia had shown when she stood against Uranus. Poseidon came next, and he too was swallowed, disappearing into the darkness with his siblings. 5 children now imprisoned, 5 divine beings trapped in endless night. And Rhea found herself pregnant for the 6th time. She was older now, worn down by repeated loss, but there was steel in her spine that hadn't been there before. This child, she decided with absolute certainty, would live. This child would see the sun and feel the wind and know what it meant to exist in the world. This child would not be swallowed. She went to her mother. Gaia still remembered her own suffering, her own imprisoned children, and the desperate measures she had taken to free them. She listened to her daughter's pain and recognized it as her own, echoed across generations. Together, the earth and the Titaness plotted. They chose a place for the birth, a cave on the island of Crete, hidden deep in the mountain, called Ida, secret and sacred. When Rhea's time came, she went there alone, telling Kronos she needed solitude for the delivery in that cave. By firelight that threw dancing shadows on ancient stone, Rhea gave birth to her 6th child. A son. She held him, really held him, for the first time feeling the weight of her own baby in her arms, for longer than a few heartbreaking moments. She looked at his face and saw strength there, saw determination, saw perhaps a hint of the man, the god he would become. She named him Zeus, which means bright or sky, a name that carried hope like a promise, but she couldn't keep him, not yet. Kronos would notice if she returned without a child to surrender. So Rhea took a stone from the cave floor, a large one, roughly the size of a swaddled infant. She wrapped it in blankets, held it as a mother holds her newborn, and took this false child back to her husband. Her hands trembled as she approached him, fear and rage and desperate hope all warring in her heart. If he looked too closely, if he questioned, if he noticed anything amiss, all would be lost. Kronos reached for the bundle. Perhaps he was so accustomed to the ritual by now that he didn't question. Perhaps his paranoia had made him careless in other ways. Perhaps the fates themselves intervened, weaving this moment into destiny. Whatever the reason, he took the stone baby from Rhea's arms and swallowed it without hesitation, feeling it drop heavily into his belly where it settled among his trapped children like a weight, like a stone, like exactly what it was. Rhea kept her face carefully neutral, but inside she sang with fierce triumph. She had done it. She had saved one child, at least. One son would grow up free, would know the world, would live. Back in the cave on Crete, Zeus lay in his hiding place, and Rhea had arranged for others to care for him. The nymphs, Adrastea and Ida, would nurse him on goat's milk from the goat Amalthea, and warriors called the Curetes would clash their spears on their shields whenever the baby cried, drowning out the sound so Kronos would never know his son lived and grew stronger with each passing day. Kronos ruled on believing himself secure. He had prevented the prophecy, or so he thought. His children were contained, controlled, unable to threaten him. The Golden Age continued, and mortals who lived in those days knew nothing of the dark secret at the heart of divine power. They saw only abundance and peace, not understanding that their God's world was built on fear and imprisonment, on swallowed children and a mother's silent grief. But Rhea knew, and on Mount Ida, in a cave that smelled of goat and smoke and ancient stone, a child was growing. Zeus was learning to crawl, to walk, to run through the mountain meadows. He was learning to think, to question, to understand. The nymphs told him stories, and eventually they told him the truth: who he was, who his father was, what had been done to his brothers and sisters. And as Zeus grew from child to youth to young man, as he felt power stirring in his veins like lightning, he began to plan. Cronos had tried to escape the pattern his father warned him about. Through violence and control, through the ultimate act of paternal dominance, he had attempted to make himself safe. But he had forgotten something essential that the Greeks understood well: you cannot escape fate by force. You cannot prevent prophecy through cruelty. The harder you grasp, the more certainly you create the very resistance that will break your grip. The Golden Age was ending, though Cronos didn't know it yet. In his belly, 5 divine children waited in darkness, growing, dreaming, preparing. And on a mountain in Crete, the 6th child stood in sunlight, young and strong and burning with purpose. The pattern that began with Uranus and Gaia, that continued with Gaia and Cronos, was about to complete its 3rd iteration. Child would overthrow parent once more. The age of the Titans was drawing to a close, and the age of the Olympians was about to begin in thunder and lightning, and the rage of a son who had learned what his father had done. Zeus rises the Titanomachy high on Mount Ida. In a cave hidden among ancient pines, a child was growing into something the cosmos had never seen before. God raised in freedom, taught by necessity, shaped by knowledge of injustice. Zeus learned to hunt in the Cretan mountains, to move silently through forests, to read the weather in the clouds. The nymphs who raised him taught him compassion, and the warriors who protected him taught him strategy. But most importantly, Zeus learned patience. He learned to wait for the right moment, to plan carefully, to move only when success was certain. The goat, Amalthea, who had nursed him with her milk, gave him one more gift before she died. Zeus took one of her horns and transformed it into the cornucopia, the horn of plenty that could produce whatever its owner desired: food, drink, anything needed. But more than material goods, that horn represented something deeper. It represented the abundance that comes from gratitude, from honoring those who nurture us, from remembering our origins, no matter how powerful we become. As Zeus grew into adulthood, magnificent in his strength and bearing, he knew he could hide no longer. His mother, Rhea, who had visited him secretly throughout his childhood, told him everything. She described his imprisoned siblings, explained his father's paranoid tyranny, recounted the whole sad history of divine succession and violence. And Zeus, hearing these stories, felt something ignite in his chest: not just anger, though there was plenty of that, but purpose. He had been saved for a reason. He had been hidden and protected so that he could do what must be done. But Zeus was not rash. Unlike his father, Cronos, who had acted from fear, Zeus acted from principle. He understood that overthrowing Cronos wasn't just about personal revenge or seizing power. It was about freeing his siblings, about ending a cycle of oppression, about creating something new. And for that, he would need help. He would need allies. He would need a plan that accounted for the immense power of the Titan king. Zeus's first move was subtle, almost gentle. With Rhea's help, he approached his father, not as an enemy, but as a cupbearer, a servant, bringing the king of Titans a drink. The cup contained a special mixture, a potion prepared by the wise Titaness Metis, whose name meant cunning intelligence. Kronos, comfortable in his power, suspicious of everything except what seemed beneath his notice, drank it down. The effect was immediate and violent. Kronos doubled over, his body convulsing, and then he began to vomit. First came the stone, the false Zeus, wrapped in blankets, clattering to the ground and revealing itself for what it was. Kronos stared at it in horror, understanding flooding through him. He had been tricked. One son had escaped. The prophecy was in motion after all. But before he could act on this realization, his body convulsed again, and out came Poseidon, fully grown now, divine and powerful and furious after years of imprisonment in darkness. Then Hades emerged, blinking in the light, and Hera, regal even in this undignified birth. Demeter came forth, and finally Hestia, the first to be swallowed and the last to be freed. They stood there, these 5 gods who had existed in suspension for so long, and they looked at their younger brother Zeus with something like wonder. He had freed them. This youth who had never been swallowed, who had grown up in sunlight and freedom, had done what they could not. And as they stood together for the first time, these 6 children of Kronos and Rhea, they felt their power multiply, felt something click into place in the cosmic order. Kronos, understanding what was happening, rose to his full height. "You dare," he said, his voice shaking the foundations of the world. "You dare challenge me." He called for his brothers and sisters, the other Titans, summoning them to war. Most answered his call out of loyalty or fear, or simply because the old order was all they knew. Oceanus stayed neutral, wrapped around the world in his great river, too vast and ancient to be moved by family conflicts. But the others came: Hyperion and Iapetus, Crius and Cous, and many more, bringing with them their own children, the second generation of Titans, Zeus and his siblings. These newly freed Olympians, for they would make their home on Mount Olympus, the highest peak in Greece, prepared for war. But Zeus knew they were outnumbered. The Titans had ruled for ages. They were established in their power, experienced in their domains. The 6 Olympians, no matter how motivated, needed more than righteous anger to win. They needed advantages. They needed weapons. They needed allies. Zeus remembered the other prisoners, the ones Kronos had freed from Gaia's depths, only to imprison again when their strangeness disturbed him. Deep in the darkness of Tartarus, that primordial abyss, 3 Cyclopes, Zeus descended into that terrible darkness, so far below the earth that the journey itself was treacherous. And he found them, their Brontes, Sterops, and Arges, and Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges, the 100-handed ones. "I am Zeus," he told them, "son of Kronos, and I have come to offer you freedom. Not the false freedom my father gave before imprisoning you again, but true freedom. In exchange, I ask for your help in the war that is coming. Will you join us?" The Cyclopes, master craftsmen, despite their single eyes, looked at this young god who spoke of freedom and alliance rather than domination. They agreed, and more than that, they used their incredible skill to forge weapons for the Olympians. For Zeus, they created the thunderbolt lightning itself, captured and weaponized, the power of the storm made tangible. When Zeus held it for the first time, he felt energy course through him, felt himself complete in a way he hadn't been before. This was his weapon, his symbol, the manifestation of his power for Poseidon. They forged a trident, three-pronged and terrible, capable of shaking the earth and stirring the seas. And for Hades, they crafted a helmet of darkness, a cap of invisibility that would allow its wearer to move unseen through any realm. These weren't just weapons, they were extensions of the gods themselves, tools that would define them for all eternity. The Hecatons, those strange beings with 50 heads and 100 arms each, pledged their strength to Zeus's cause. With their multitude of hands, they could hurl boulders like rain, could fight with the power of 100 warriors in each massive body. If you're enjoying this journey through time, consider subscribing so you never miss a story. These ancient tales have so much to teach us about power, family, and the cycles that shape our lives. Now the sides were set. On Mount Olympus, Zeus and his siblings prepared, joined by the Cyclopes and Hecatonchios and a few other deities who sensed which way the future was turning. On Mount Othrys, the Titan's fortress, Kronos rallied his forces, determined to crush this rebellion and prove his father's prophecy false, even though each action he took only drove it toward fulfillment. When it began, shook the cosmos to its foundations. The Greeks called it the Titanomachy, the War of Titans, and it lasted 10 years. Imagine 10 years of divine combat, of lightning splitting the sky and earthquakes tearing the ground, of oceans rising in massive waves and mountains crumbling to dust. The mortal world, young and fragile, suffered terribly. Each day the battle raged, sometimes on the earth, sometimes in the heavens, sometimes in the depths of the sea. Zeus hurled his thunderbolts, and where they struck, reality itself seemed to crack. Poseidon struck the ground with his trident, and tsunamis rose to swallow Titan armies. Hades moved unseen through the chaos, striking from invisibility, spreading fear and confusion. Hera, Demeter, and Hestia each fought with their own powers, each determined to ensure they would never be imprisoned again. The Hecatonchires were devastating. Standing like mountains, they bent down and tore boulders from the earth itself, hurling hundreds of stones with their 100 hands, creating storms of rock that no army could withstand. The Titans fought back with desperate fury, knowing that defeat meant the end of their age, the end of everything they had built and ruled. For 10 years, the battle raged without clear victor. Both sides were divine, immortal, difficult to truly defeat. The stalemate seemed eternal, and the world groaned under the weight of divine war. But slowly, gradually, the tide turned. The Olympians had something the Titans lacked: unity of purpose. The Titans fought to maintain the old order, to keep what they had, to prevent change. The Olympians fought for freedom, for justice, for a new world. And that difference, subtle but profound, gave them the edge they needed. In the final battle, Zeus summoned all his power. He called down lightning like the world had never seen, bolt after bolt after bolt, until the sky was more bright than dark, until the air itself seemed made of electricity. The heat was so intense that the earth began to melt, rivers boiled away, and the very fabric of reality seemed about to tear. The Titans, exhausted and overwhelmed, finally broke. Kronos, seeing his forces scatter, made one last stand. Father and son faced each other across a battlefield littered with the debris of broken mountains and scorched earth. For a moment, perhaps Kronos saw in Zeus's face an echo of his younger self, the son who had stood against his own father for his mother's sake. Perhaps he understood, in that final moment, that the pattern was indeed inescapable, that violence begets violence, that the seeds we plant always grow into the harvest we fear. Zeus raised his thunderbolt. "You swallowed my brothers and sisters," he said, his voice carrying the weight of judgment. "You imprisoned those who should have been free. You ruled through fear and cruelty. That age is over, Father. It ends here, now, with me." The thunderbolt struck and Kronos fell. The king of Titans, who had ruled the Golden Age, who had overthrown his own father, who had swallowed his children to prevent his own overthrow, fell at last to the prophecy he had spent his entire reign trying to prevent. The surviving Titans were bound in chains forged by the Cyclopes, chains that could hold even divine power and cast into Tartarus, that deep abyss from which Zeus had freed the Cyclope. There they would remain, imprisoned in darkness, guarded by the Hecatonchires, who had helped bring about their defeat. It was a mercy, perhaps, that Zeus didn't destroy them. They were his aunts and uncles, after all, family despite everything. But they could not be allowed to threaten the new order, and so the age of Titans ended, and the age of Olympians began. The Olympian order gods, domains and divine dysfunction with the cosmos now divided. A new order emerged on Mount Olympus, the highest peak in all of Greece, where snow touched clouds and clouds touched heaven. The victorious gods gathered there to establish their rule, and you can imagine the scene: these divine beings, still carrying the dust of war on their skin, coming together to determine how the world would be governed from this moment forward. They had won their freedom, had overthrown the old tyranny, but now came the harder task, deciding what to build in its place. But among all these divine dramas, one figure stood apart in his love for humanity. Prometheus was a Titan, but he had sided with Zeus during the Titanomachy, had used his gift of foresight to predict the Olympians' victory and join the winning side. His name meant forethought, and he lived up to it, always thinking ahead, always planning, always considering consequences that others missed. After the war, when most of his fellow Titans were imprisoned in Tartarus, Prometheus remained free, honored for his allegiance to the new order. But Prometheus had a quality that set him apart from most of the immortals. He cared deeply about mortals. The exact creation of humanity varies in different Greek tellings. Sometimes humans emerged from the earth like plants. Sometimes they were shaped from clay. Sometimes they simply appeared as part of the natural world. What matters is that they were weak, vulnerable creatures without the natural advantages of other animals. They had no fur to keep them warm, no claws or fangs to defend themselves, no keen senses to detect danger. They were, in almost every way, poorly equipped for survival. Prometheus looked at humanity and felt compassion. Here were beings with potential. They could think, could learn, could create, but they lacked the tools to fulfill that potential. They huddled in caves, afraid of the dark, prey to wild animals, dying from cold and hunger. Meanwhile, on Olympus, the gods feasted in luxury, indifferent to mortal suffering. This bothered Prometheus in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Perhaps he saw in humanity something the gods had lost: humility, gratitude, the appreciation that comes from genuine need rather than eternal plenty. The gods possessed fire, that transformative element that could warm, cook, illuminate, forge. Fire was divine, belonging to the realm of immortals. Mortals lived in cold darkness, and Zeus intended to keep it that way. Why should humans have access to divine power? They were meant to worship and serve, not to compete or create. But Prometheus disagreed. He watched mortals shivering through winter nights, eating raw meat, fleeing from predators after sunset, and he decided to act. One night, when the gods were distracted by one of their endless feasts, Prometheus climbed to the heavens. Different versions tell it different ways. Some say he lit a torch from the sun itself. Others that he stole a spark from the forge of Hephaestus. Still others that he took fire directly from Zeus's lightning. The method matters less than the act. Prometheus took fire, hid it in a hollow fennel stalk so its heat wouldn't burn him, and brought it down to earth. Imagine being one of those first humans to receive fire. You've lived your entire life in darkness after sunset, have known only cold, have eaten only raw food, have been vulnerable to every predator that hunts at night. And then this immortal being appears and gives you flame. Watch it dance and flicker. Feel its warmth pushing back the cold. See how it makes shadows flee and reveals what was hidden. Fire meant survival, yes, but it meant more than that. It meant the beginning of civilization. With fire, humans could cook food and make it safer to eat, could work metal and create tools, could clear land for farming, could light the darkness and extend the day, could gather together in its warmth and build community. Fire was transformative, and Prometheus knew it. By giving mortals fire, he was giving them the ability to shape their own destiny, to become something more than cowering animals waiting to die. He was giving them, in essence, a spark of the divine, the power to change the world rather than merely endure it. Zeus noticed almost immediately. The king of gods looked down from Olympus and saw tiny fires spreading across the earth, saw humans cooking and forging and gathering in ways they never had before. He knew instantly what had happened and who was responsible. His rage was terrible, shaking the foundations of heaven. Prometheus had defied him, had stolen what belonged to the gods, had empowered mortals without divine permission. This could not stand. Zeus summoned Prometheus to Olympus. The Titan came willingly, his head held high, unrepentant. "You stole fire," Zeus said, his voice low and dangerous. "You gave mortals what I specifically denied them." Why? Prometheus met his gaze steadily. Because they needed it. Because they suffer needlessly while we feast in luxury. Because they have potential that your indifference was wasting. I did what was right, regardless of your will. The throne room fell silent. No one spoke to Zeus this way. No one challenged his authority so directly. For a moment, perhaps Zeus considered simply blasting Prometheus with a thunderbolt, ending his defiance in an instant. But Prometheus was immortal, and Zeus wanted him to suffer in a way that death, or whatever passes for death among immortals, could not provide. "You love humanity so much," Zeus said finally, "then you will watch them for eternity, and they will watch you suffer. And all will understand the price of defying the gods." Zeus ordered Hephaestus, the smith god, to forge chains that could bind even a titan. Poor Hephaestus, who probably felt some sympathy for Prometheus, but dared not disobey Zeus, created chains of adamant, unbreakable, and eternal. Prometheus was dragged to the Caucasus Mountains, to a desolate peak where wind howled and no comfort could be found. There he was chained to the rock, his arms spread wide, his body exposed to the elements. But the chains were only the beginning of his punishment. Zeus sent an eagle, or, in some versions, a vulture to visit Prometheus each day. The bird would tear open his abdomen and eat his liver, consuming it completely, while Prometheus screamed in agony. Liver, the Greeks believed, was the seat of emotion and passion, making this torture both physical and spiritual. And because Prometheus was immortal, his liver would regenerate each night, growing back completely so that the next day the eagle could return and eat it again. Day after day, year after year, century after century, the pattern repeated: pain, death, rebirth, pain again. Can you imagine it? Being chained to a rock, unable to move, unable to escape, knowing that every sunrise brings renewed torment. Prometheus hung there, and below him humanity lived and thrived with the fire he had given them. They built civilizations, created art, developed philosophy and mathematics and medicine. They became more than animals, became beings capable of amazing things. And Prometheus, watching them grow and flourish, found meaning in his suffering. He had made a choice, had paid a price, and the price was worth it because mortals now had a chance. But Zeus wasn't finished punishing humanity for Prometheus's gift. If mortals wanted to be more like gods, Zeus decided they should also experience divine problems. So he ordered Hephaestus to create something new, the first woman. Until this point, humanity had been only male, according to this particular telling. Hephaestus molded her from clay, and each god gave her a gift. Athena taught her crafts, Aphrodite gave her beauty, Hermes gave her cunning and deceit. They named her Pandora, which means all-gifted, and she was beautiful and complex and fascinating. Zeus sent Pandora to Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother, whose name meant afterthought. He acted first and considered consequences later. The opposite of his brother. Prometheus had warned Epimetheus never to accept gifts from Zeus, but Epimetheus took one look at Pandora and all caution fled. He married her, welcomed her into his home, and she brought with her a jar, not a box. The Greeks said jar, but somewhere in translation it became a box and has stayed that way in popular imagination. Zeus had told Pandora never to open this jar, knowing full well that this command would make it irresistible. And one day, curiosity or boredom or simple human nature overtook her, and Pandora lifted the lid. Out flew all the evils that plague humanity: disease and death, sorrow and suffering, jealousy and hatred, pain and despair. They escaped into the world and spread among mortals who had known hardship before but now experienced new forms of anguish. Pandora, horrified at what she had done, slammed the lid closed. But it was too late. The evils had escaped. Only one thing remained trapped in the jar: elpis, which translates as hope or expectation. The Greeks were ambiguous about whether Pandora trapping hope inside was a blessing or a curse. Does humanity need hope to endure suffering? Or is hope itself a form of torture, always promising better days that may never come? The myth doesn't answer definitively, leaving us to wonder. So this was Zeus's revenge for Prometheus's gift. Mortals got fire and all the progress it enabled, yes, but they also got suffering and evil and death. They got knowledge and power, but they also got consequences and limitations. They became more like gods in some ways, but they would never be gods, would always be vulnerable, would always eventually die. And Prometheus hung on his rock, suffering his eternal punishment, and the world turned below him. Eventually, after thousands of years, he would be freed by Heracles, but that's another story, another piece of the vast tapestry of Greek myth. What matters here is the choice Prometheus made and what it represents. He saw suffering he could alleviate, a wrong he could right, and he acted knowing full well that there would be consequences. He loved humanity more than he feared Zeus's wrath. The Greeks honored Prometheus, not as a rebel for rebellion's sake, but as a figure who understood that progress requires sacrifice, that helping others often costs us dearly, that defying unjust authority, even divine authority, can be necessary and noble. They saw in him the price of knowledge, the cost of civilization, the suffering that comes with choosing compassion over comfort. Heroes and monsters, the age of mortals. As the gods settled into their eternal patterns, a new kind of story began on earth. The age of heroes emerged, a time when mortals, often with divine blood flowing through their veins, performed impossible feats, slew terrible monsters, went on epic quests, and showed what humanity could achieve when pushed to its limits. These weren't just adventure stories told for entertainment, though they certainly entertained. They were teaching tools, moral guides, cautionary tales about courage and hubris, fate and free will, the proper relationship between mortals and gods. The world that heroes inhabited was dangerous in ways difficult to imagine today. Monsters prowled the wild places, creatures born from divine unions or godly curses, beings that represented humanity's deepest fears made flesh. The Greeks understood that civilization was a fragile thing, a small circle of light surrounded by vast darkness, filled with things that wanted to destroy it. Heroes were the ones who ventured into that darkness, making the world a little safer for everyone else. Perseus was one of the earliest heroes, son of Zeus and the mortal woman Dano. His grandfather, King Heracles, had locked Dano in a bronze chamber because a prophecy warned that her son would kill him. But Zeus came to her as golden rain. The gods could take any form they desired, and Perseus was conceived. When Heracles discovered the baby, he locked mother and child in a chest and threw it into the sea, preferring indirect murder to direct filicide. But the gods protected them, and they washed ashore on the island of Syra, where a fisherman named Dictys raised Perseus as his own. Years later, when Perseus had grown into a strong young man, the king of Seriphos desired Dano and wanted Perseus out of the way. He sent the hero on what he thought was an impossible quest: bring back the head of Medusa, one of the three Gorgon sisters. Medusa had once been beautiful, a priestess of Athena, but Poseidon had violated her in Athena's temple. Athena, in her rage, directed at the victim rather than the perpetrator. As God's logic often worked, transformed Medusa into a monster. Her hair became writhing snakes, and anyone who looked directly at her face turned instantly to stone. Perseus, aided by the gods, Athena lent him her polished shield, Hermes gave him winged sandals. Hades provided his helm of invisibility, approached Medusa's cave. He used the shield as a mirror, looking at her reflection rather than directly at her. And as she slept, surrounded by the stone statues of her victims, he cut off her head. From her severed neck sprang Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysor, a giant with a golden sword, children she had been carrying from her union with Poseidon, born at the moment of their mother's death, flying home on winged sandals, carrying Medusa's head in a bag. He found the princess Andromeda chained to a rock as sacrifice to a sea monster. He rescued her, married her, and eventually fulfilled the prophecy about his grandfather in a tragic accident at an athletic competition. The Greeks were telling us something important. You cannot escape fate. Even prophecies you try desperately to prevent often come true through your very efforts to avoid them. Then there was Heracles, called Hercules by the Romans, perhaps the most famous hero of all. Son of Zeus and the mortal Alcmene, Heracles possessed tremendous strength from birth as an infant. He strangled 2 serpents Hera sent to kill him. Hera hated all of Zeus's illegitimate children, and she hated Heracles most of all because his very name meant glory of Hera, a name chosen to try to appease her that only made her angrier. Hera cursed Heracles with madness, and in his insanity he killed his own wife and children. When the madness lifted and he realized what he had done, his grief was absolute. He consulted the oracle at Delphi, seeking redemption, and was told to serve King Eurystheus for 12 years, performing whatever labors the king demanded. Thus began the famous 12 labors of Heracles. He strangled the Nemean lion, whose hide was impervious to weapons, and wore its pelt as armor. He killed the 9-headed Hydra, whose heads regrew when severed until he learned to cauterize the stumps. He captured the golden hind, cleaned the Augean stables, drove away the Stymphalian birds, captured the Cretan bull, stole the mares of Diomedes, obtained the girdle of Hippolyta, stole the cattle of Geryon, fetched the apples of the Hesperides, and finally descended into the underworld itself to bring back Cerberus, the 3-headed dog who guarded the gates of death. Each labor seemed impossible. Each required not just strength, but cunning, perseverance, the ability to solve problems that couldn't be overcome by brute force alone. Heracles showed that being a hero meant more than being strong. It meant enduring, adapting, never giving up, even when the task seemed hopeless. Theseus of Athens fought the Minotaur, that half-bull creature born from Queen Persephone's unnatural union with a bull itself, a consequence of offending Poseidon. The Minotaur lived in the center of an elaborate labyrinth beneath the palace of Crete, and each year Athens had to send 7 young men and 7 young women to be devoured by the monster as tribute. Theseus volunteered to be one of the 14, determined to kill the Minotaur and end the tribute forever. With the help of Ariadne, daughter of King Minos, who fell in love with Theseus and gave him a ball of thread to mark his path through the labyrinth, Theseus entered the maze. He found the Minotaur in the darkness. Imagine encountering that creature, hearing its breathing, smelling its bestial scent, knowing that this thing had killed so many before you. Theseus fought and killed it, followed the thread back to the entrance, and sailed home with Ariadne, though he would later abandon her on an island in a story that shows even heroes could be callous and cruel. Jason led the Argonauts, a crew of heroes on a quest for the golden fleece. This fleece hung in a grove in Chalcis, guarded by a dragon that never slept. Jason needed it to reclaim his rightful throne, usurped by his uncle. The voyage of the Argo was filled with adventures. They encountered the clashing rocks that crushed ships between them, the harpies that tormented the prophet Phineus, the bronze giant Talos who guarded Crete in Chalcis. The sorceress Medea fell in love with Jason and helped him complete the impossible tasks her father set. She gave him a potion to protect him from fire-breathing bulls, told him how to defeat the warriors that sprang from dragons' teeth sewn in the ground, and put the sleepless dragon to sleep, so Jason could take the fleece. These stories have survived thousands of years. What do you think they still teach us today? Perhaps that courage matters, that cleverness can overcome strength, that the impossible might be possible if we're persistent enough. Or perhaps darker lessons that heroes often left destruction in their wake, that divine favor was fickle, that happy endings were rare and often temporary, because we must also speak of the monsters, those creatures that made heroes necessary. Medusa with her petrifying gaze, the Minotaur in its labyrinth, Cerberus guarding death's gate, the Hydra with its regenerating heads, Scylla and Charybdis, the twin threats that Odysseus would navigate. Scylla, a six-headed monster that devoured sailors, Charybdis, a whirlpool that swallowed entire ships, the Chimera, a fire-breathing creature with a lion's head, goat's body, and serpent's tail, the Sphinx that asked riddles and devoured those who answered incorrectly. These monsters represented specific fears. The Minotaur was bestiality and the bestial nature within humans, the cost of offending gods, the darkness at the heart of civilization. Medusa was the danger of beauty, the victim transformed into monster, the power of the female gaze turned weaponized and deadly. The Hydra showed that some problems multiply when you attack them directly, that brute force isn't always the answer. Scylla and Charybdis represented impossible choices, situations where any path leads to loss. The Greeks understood that the world is dangerous, that there are forces, natural and supernatural, that want to harm us, that civilization requires constant vigilance against chaos. But they also believed that these forces could be confronted, that with courage and intelligence, and perhaps a little divine help, even the most terrible monsters could be defeated. Heroes made the world safer, not by eliminating danger entirely that was impossible, but by pushing it back, creating spaces where ordinary people could live without quite so much fear. And yet, the heroes themselves were complicated figures. Perseus killed Medusa, but we might ask whether she deserved death, given that she was a victim before becoming a monster. Heracles performed amazing labors, but he also killed his own family in madness and later murdered guests in a fit of rage. Theseus abandoned Ariadne after she saved his life, and his father killed himself, believing Theseus had died because Theseus forgot to change his sail from black to white as promised. Jason won the Golden Fleece with Medea's help, then abandoned her for a younger, politically advantageous bride. Medea's revenge was to kill their children and Jason's new wife, showing that scorned women could be as monstrous as any creature. The Greeks didn't believe in purely good heroes or purely evil villains. They understood that people, even heroic people, perhaps especially heroic people, were capable of both greatness and terrible cruelty, that the same traits that made someone heroic might also make them dangerous, that strength without wisdom was destructive, that cleverness without morality was evil. As you drift toward sleep, picture these heroes in their time, young men and women, facing impossible odds, venturing into darkness, confronting their fears made manifest in monstrous form. They weren't perfect, but they were brave. They weren't always moral, but they were determined. They expanded the boundaries of what humanity could achieve, pushed back against the limitations imposed by gods and fate and their own mortality. And in doing so, they gave the Greeks and give us still models of how to face our own monsters, whatever form they take. The Trojan warfare myth meets memory, but of all the stories the Greeks told, none echoed longer through history than the war at Troy. This was the great defining myth of Greek culture, the story that poets sang for centuries, that shaped their understanding of war and honor, fate and human nature. And here's something fascinating. Unlike the obviously fantastical tales of monsters and magical objects, the Trojan War might actually have happened. Archaeologists have found ruins of Troy in modern Turkey, evidence of destruction and warfare, layers of cities built and destroyed and rebuilt. The war that Homer sang about might be a distant memory of real Bronze Age conflicts, transformed through generations of oral storytelling into something both historical and mythical. The war began, as so many disasters begin, with divine vanity and a beauty contest. The goddess Eris, whose name meant discord, was angry at being excluded from a wedding feast. In revenge, she tossed a golden apple into the celebration, inscribed with the words to the fairest. Three goddesses immediately claimed it: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. None would yield to the others, and Zeus, wisely refusing to judge such a contest himself, appointed a mortal to make the choice. Pris, a prince of Troy, who was living as a shepherd on Mount Ida, unaware of his royal birth. The three goddesses appeared before Paris, and each offered him a bribe. Hera promised power. She would make him lord of Europe and Asia, the most powerful king in the world. Athena offered glory in battle, victory in war, skill in combat, honor that would never fade. Aphrodite, cleverest of all, promised him the most beautiful woman in the world as his wife. Paris, young and romantic, and probably not thinking about consequences, chose Aphrodite. The problem was that the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, was already married. She was queen of Sparta, wed to King Menelaus, and by all accounts they had a good marriage. But Aphrodite had promised, and gods kept their promises even when doing so caused catastrophe. She arranged for Paris to visit Sparta as a guest, and there he and Helen saw each other and fell instantly, helplessly in love. Or perhaps Aphrodite simply made them believe they were in love, using her divine power to fulfill her bargain. Paris and Helen fled to Troy together, though tellings differ on whether Helen went willingly or was kidnapped. It might not have mattered to the result. Menelaus was humiliated and enraged. He called upon all the Greek kings who had once been Helen's suitors. They had sworn an oath to defend her marriage to whichever of them she chose. Now that oath came due. Led by Menelaus's brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and the most powerful ruler in Greece, the Greek forces assembled. Over 1,000 ships, according to legend, sailed across the Aegean Sea toward Troy to retrieve Helen and punish Paris. The war lasted 10 years. Think about that 10 years of siege, of battles, of men dying far from home, of families waiting for fathers and sons and husbands who would never return. Troy had strong walls and brave defenders led by Prince Hector, Paris's brother, who was everything. Paris was not courageous, honorable, dutiful. The Greeks had mighty warriors of their own. Achilles, the greatest fighter who ever lived, swift and deadly, and nearly invincible. Ajax, massive and strong as a tower. Odysseus, clever and resourceful, always thinking 3 moves ahead. But the war ground on without clear victor. Men fought and died. Heroes on both sides fell, and neither army could gain decisive advantage. The gods, of course, took sides. Aphrodite supported Troy because Paris had chosen her. Hera and Athena, bitter about losing the beauty contest, backed the Greeks. Zeus tried to remain neutral, but found himself drawn in by the arguments and appeals of other deities. Divine interference influenced battles, saved favored mortals from death, struck down others. The war in heaven mirrored the war on earth. Achilles dominated the early years of the war, killing Trojans by the hundreds, driving them back to their walls again and again. But then Agamemnon, in his arrogance, took Achilles' war prize, a captured woman named Briseis. Achilles, his honor insulted, withdrew from battle. Without him, the Greeks began to lose. The Trojans pushed them back toward their ships, and it seemed Troy might actually win. Achilles watched his comrades die and refused to help, nursing his wounded pride. Finally, his closest companion, Patroclus, begged to join the fighting, wearing Achilles' armor to inspire the Greeks. Achilles agreed, but warned him only to drive the Trojans back, not to pursue them to the city walls. Patroclus, caught up in battle fury, ignored this warning. He pushed too far, and Hector killed him, stripping Achilles' armor from his body. When Achilles learned of Patroclus's death, his grief was terrible, absolute, the kind of sorrow that shakes the world. Whether Patroclus was his friend, cousin, or lover, different traditions suggest different relationships. The loss devastated him. His mother, Thetis, a sea nymph, brought him new armor forged by Hephaestus himself. Armor described in such loving detail by Homer that we can almost see it glinting in the sun, a shield decorated with the entire cosmos, breastplate and greaves and helmet of divine craftsmanship. Armored and armed, mad with grief and rage, Achilles returned to battle. He was unstoppable, barely human in his fury, killing so many Trojans that the river ran red with blood, and the river god himself rose up to protest. Achilles fought the river and won. He chased the Trojans back to their walls, and there he met Hector. Hector knew he was going to die. He ran from Achilles, circling Troy's walls 3 times, while everyone watched his parents on the walls above. His wife Andromache holding their infant son, the Greek army eager for his death, the Trojan army helpless to save him. Finally, with Athena's deceptive help, Achilles cornered Hector. They fought, and Achilles killed him, then did something terrible, even by the standards of that brutal war. He tied Hector's corpse to his chariot and dragged it around Troy's walls, dishonoring the body of Troy's greatest defender. 4 days Achilles kept Hector's body, refusing burial. Then Hector's father, old King Priam, did something incredibly brave. He went alone at night into the Greek camp, risking death or capture, and came to Achilles' tent. He knelt before the man who had killed so many of his sons, and he begged for Hector's body so he could give his son proper funeral rites. Here the Greeks showed profound understanding of what it means to be human. Achilles looked at Priam and saw his own father, aging and far away. He thought of Patroclus, of his own grief, and recognized the same grief in this enemy king. He wept, and Priam wept with him, and in that moment of shared sorrow, they transcended the war that separated them. Achilles gave back Hector's body, and the two enemies shared a meal together before Priam returned to Troy to bury his son with honor. But the war wasn't over. Achilles himself would soon die, shot in his vulnerable heel by Paris, guided by a only part of him that could be injured, because his mother had dipped him in the river Styx as an infant to make him invincible. But she held him by the heel, which remained dry. Even the greatest warrior was mortal, was vulnerable, would die. The war finally ended through Odysseus's cunning. The Greeks built an enormous wooden horse, hid their best warriors inside it, and pretended to sail away, leaving the horse as an offering to Athena. The Trojans, celebrating what they thought was Greek surrender, dragged the horse inside their city, despite warnings from the prophet Cassandra, cursed by Apollo to always speak true prophecies that no one believed. That night, the warriors emerged from the horse, opened the city gates, and the Greek army poured in. Troy burned. Priam was killed at the altar of Zeus. Hector's wife was enslaved. His son was thrown from the walls. Helen, the woman whose face, as Christopher Marlowe would later write, launched 1,000 ships, was taken back by men, though accounts differ on whether he forgave her or killed her. The survivors scattered. Odysseus began his 10-year journey home, which would become another epic tale. Agamemnon returned to be murdered by his wife and her lover. The Trojan prince Aeneas escaped with a few followers and, according to Roman legend, eventually founded Rome. The great Bronze Age civilizations that fought this war, if it was a war. If it was, history collapsed shortly after, entering a dark age that wouldn't end for centuries. The Greeks told this story again and again because it contained everything they thought mattered: honor and pride, courage and cowardice, love and hate, fate and choice, the glory of heroism and the tragedy of war. They understood that war is terrible even when necessary, that it destroys heroes and innocents alike, that even the victors pay terrible prices. They saw in Achilles both admirable courage and dangerous pride. They saw in Hector the doomed nobility of fighting for home and family against overwhelming odds. They saw in Helen both the most beautiful woman in the world and the cause of catastrophic war. And they debated for centuries whether she was victim or villain. The Trojan War, whether historical or mythical or some blend of both, became the defining story of Greek identity. It shaped their art for centuries: pottery, sculpture, drama, poetry, all returned again and again to Troy. It gave them their greatest literary work, Homer's Iliad, which focused not on the whole war but on a few weeks in its 10th year, using that slice to illuminate eternal truths about humanity. And it connected myth to memory, bridging the gap between divine stories and human history in a way that made both seem more real. Asterisk. Closing reflection. Why these stories endure. Asterisk. Now, as you lie here in the darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, Consider why these ancient stories still matter. The Greeks who created these myths lived thousands of years ago in a world completely different from ours. They had no electricity, no modern medicine, no understanding of science as we know it. Most of them would live and die within a few miles of where they were born. Their lives were short, often brutal, filled with uncertainties we can barely imagine. And yet they created stories so powerful, so resonant with human truth, that we still tell them today, still find meaning in them, still recognize ourselves in gods and heroes who never existed. Greek mythology wasn't scripture in the way we often think of religious texts. The Greeks didn't have a holy book that dictated one true version of events. Instead, they had poets and storytellers, each telling the tales slightly differently, emphasizing different aspects, exploring different interpretations. Homer's version of events might differ from Hesiod's, and both might differ from what was told in Athens versus Sparta versus Thebes. This flexibility was a strength, not a weakness. It allowed the myths to evolve, to stay relevant, to speak to each new generation in ways that met their particular needs. These stories were how the Greeks understood their world. When they saw lightning split the sky, they imagined Zeus hurling thunderbolts. When they felt the earth shake beneath their feet, they knew Poseidon was striking it with his trident. When crops failed, they understood that Demeter was grieving for her daughter. When a plague swept through the city, they knew some god had been offended and required appeasement. In giving natural phenomena divine personalities, they made the world feel more comprehensible, more responsive to human action. You couldn't control the weather, but you could pray to Zeus. You couldn't stop earthquakes, but you could honor Poseidon. But it was more than just explaining nature. Greek mythology was fundamentally about trying to understand what it means to be human. Why do we suffer? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do we desire what destroys us? Why do children defy parents? Why do parents fail their children? Why is power so often abused? Why is beauty sometimes a curse? Why does knowledge come at such high cost? The Greeks explored these questions not through abstract philosophy alone, but through vivid stories, populated by beings they could visualize, could imagine, could relate to. And here's what makes Greek gods so enduringly fascinating. They were flawed. They were immortal and powerful, yes, but they weren't omniscient or omnibenevolent. They made mistakes, felt jealousy and lust and rage, acted from wounded pride or desperate love. Zeus, king of gods, couldn't keep his pants on and was constantly deceiving his wife. Hera, protector of marriage, spent much of her energy punishing her husband's lovers rather than her husband. Ares loved violence for its own sake. Aphrodite caused wars with her gifts. Apollo and Artemis killed innocent children to punish their mother's boasting. The gods' imperfections made them relatable in ways that perfect deities never could be. When the Greeks prayed to gods who themselves struggled with jealousy, who made poor decisions, who suffered consequences, they were praying to beings who understood human failings from the inside. There's something profoundly comforting in that, even as it's also terrifying if even the gods can't always control themselves or events. What hope do mere mortals have? The heroes, too, were complicated. Perseus killed Medusa, but Medusa was a victim before becoming a monster. Heracles performed amazing labors but also killed his own family. Theseus defeated the Minotaur, but abandoned the woman who made his victory possible. Achilles was the greatest warrior who ever lived, but his pride cost Greek lives, and his rage led him to dishonor the dead. The Greeks understood that heroism and villainy could coexist in the same person, that great deeds didn't erase terrible ones, that complexity was more honest than simplicity. These myths taught practical lessons. The story of Pandora explained why evil exists in the world, and why we nonetheless cling to hope. The tale of Prometheus illustrated that progress requires sacrifice, that defying unjust authority might be noble even when it's costly. The story of Icarus, who flew too close to the sun on wax wings and fell to his death, taught about the dangers of hubris, of overreaching ambition. The tale of Narcissus, who fell in love with his own reflection and wasted away staring at it, warned against self-obsession. King Midas, granted the power to turn everything he touched to gold, learned that some gifts are curses when he transformed his beloved daughter into a golden statue. But beyond practical lessons, these stories did something more profound. They connected the Greeks to each other and to their past. When you traveled to any Greek city, you would find temples to the same gods, though perhaps emphasized differently. When you attended dramatic festivals, you would watch plays about Agamemnon and Oedipus and Medea that everyone in the audience already knew. The power coming not from surprise, but from how this particular telling illuminated familiar truths. When you participated in the Olympic Games, you were honoring Zeus. When you consulted the oracle at Delphi, you were seeking Apollo's wisdom. The myths were the common language of Greek culture, the shared stories that made them one people, despite being divided into competing city-states. And here we are, thousands of years later, still telling these stories. We name planets after Roman versions of Greek gods: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. We use their names in our language: narcissistic, erotic, titanic, Herculean, Odyssey. We return to these myths again and again in our own stories, reimagining them for new contexts, finding in them resonances with our own experiences. We may not believe in Zeus or Athena or Apollo as the Greeks did, but we recognize psychological truths in their stories that feel eternal. Perhaps that's what myths are. Really not lies that ancient people believed because they didn't know better, but truths told in the language of story rather than fact. When the Greeks said Prometheus gave humans fire and was punished eternally for it, they were telling a truth about innovation and progress, that advancement often comes from defying authority, that those who help humanity often pay terrible prices, that knowledge and technology are double-edged gifts. When they said Pandora opened a jar and released all evils into the world but trapped hope inside, they were exploring the ambiguous nature of hope itself. Is it what saves us, or what torments us by promising what might never come? Thank you for traveling through these ancient stories with me. If you'd like more journeys through history, subscribe and let me know what era calls to you next. There are countless stories still to explore, countless voices from the past waiting to speak to us if we take the time to listen. The Greeks looked at existence and saw mystery, beauty, tragedy, comedy, all intertwined. They saw gods who were powerful, but not all-powerful, wise but not all-knowing, good but not all good. They saw heroes who achieved greatness but paid the price for it. They saw monsters that represented fears that couldn't be fully conquered, only confronted with courage. And they took all of this, the complexity, the contradictions, the painful truths, and turned it into stories that have lasted millennia. As you close your eyes now, as your breathing deepens and sleep begins to claim you, let yourself feel connected to that ancient tradition. The Greeks told stories by firelight, passing them from voice to voice, generation to generation, century to century, until somehow, impossibly, they reached you here, tonight. You're part of that chain now, part of the unbroken tradition of humans telling stories to make sense of existence, to find meaning in chaos, to connect with each other across the vast distances of time and culture and circumstance. Somewhere, in the darkness behind your eyelids, the gods still feast on Olympus. Prometheus still hangs on his rock, watching humanity thrive with the fire he gave them. Heroes still fight their monsters, still undertake their impossible quests, and the stories still echo, still resonate, still teach and comfort and challenge us, because they speak to something fundamental in the human heart: our need for meaning, our capacity for wonder, our insistence that even in a universe that seems indifferent or cruel, there are stories worth telling and truths worth knowing. Now, as you drift deeper into sleep, imagine those ancient storytellers around their fires, passing these tales from voice to voice until they reached you here tonight. You've heard the entire story of Greek mythology, from chaos to Olympus, from creation to the Trojan War, from gods to heroes to the monsters they fought. And in hearing it, you've connected yourself to thousands of years of human storytelling, to the Greeks who created these myths, and everyone since who has found meaning in them. Rest now. Dream well. The gods and heroes will be waiting whenever you return.